Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Dan, do I just start? Okay, I'll just start. Um, it's my great pleasure to be here today. I'm talking about new research that has me really excited, and it's my honor to be joined by two people I'm honored to call colleagues, Marvin Bolt, the legendary curator of science and technology at the Corning Museum of Glass, now emeritus, and Sandy Chang, a Yale College Associate Dean for Science, a professor of medicine at the Yale Medical School, and also an avid mirror maker who's going to give us the kind of concrete version of what mirror making is actually like, and Giorgio Strano, curator of the historical collections of the Museo Galileo in Florence. And I'm honored to call all of them friends and colleagues. So I'm just going to start, and then each of my co-participants is going to do a little bit of talking, and then the four of us are going to be engaged in a discussion. And the main discussion has to do with this new text that I found, and I'm going to introduce that right now. So first slide. So in pre-modern China, eclipses held prognostic significance. In 1610, a solar eclipse failed to be predicted, and the Ministry of Rites of the Ming Dynasty began seriously considering methods to reform the calendar. By the 1630s, three different sets of calculations for predicting solar eclipses were being evaluated. Those predicted by scholars at the Ministry of Rites, by those
camera on finally. Okay.
Hello? Those calculations by Uyghurs using Arabic techniques. And finally, next slide, by the Jesuits, whose main advocate was the Catholic convert and official Xu Guangqi. And here's a picture of a Jesuit and Xu Guangqi together, obviously drawn by an Italian. Eventually, the European calculations were deemed most accurate, but the telescope was vital in evaluating the three sets of answers because the timing and magnitude of a solar eclipse cannot be measured with the naked eye without risking blindness. So telescopes were set up to project images of the sun onto a piece of paper or silk, and from that point on, telescopes played an important function at the court. Various court documents mention first next slide, please. Various court documents mention first the telescopes presented by the Jesuits, and then the Ming court's own work to produce more telescopes. But as far as we know, though Marvin's experience may differ, it's a little teaser, none of these telescopes have survived. So in 2017, next slide, please, in the Zhejiang Library, the scholar Gou Yan rediscovered an undated manuscript, a copy of Kaichen Jiyao that was attributed to Matteo Ricci and supposedly edited by Xu Guangqi. A few pages of it concerned the making of telescopes. Next slide, please. And the dates, of course, did I say next slide? I'm asking for the next slide, please. The dating of it, of course, makes Ricci's authorship impossible because, of course, Ricci had died in China while Galileo was making his first telescopes. On the basis of echoes between Kaichen Jiyao and established writings of Xu Guangqi, and also the way in which the manuscript was passed down by Xu's descendants, Gong argues that Xu is by far the likeliest author. My guess is that these notes on telescope making date from the very last years of Xu Guangqi's life, around 1630, and are his notes from the state's effort to make telescopes. Next slide, please. So here is Kaichen Jiyao on the process of grinding a lens with mention of all the main components necessary: the mold, the wood holder, the gum to affix glass and wood, the multiple kinds of grit necessary first to grind and then to polish, and of course the water to keep the glass smooth. Grammatically, it translates into straightforward English, but the text makes sense only insofar as the reader already has some basic familiarity with the process. And I'm not gonna lie, some parts remain obscure to me. Next slide, please. What does he mean by a kettle pot shape? I'm not sure. Other passages though they deploy words that are to be found nowhere else in classical Chinese, are quite clear to someone who has some sense of lens fabrication. Here is Xu Guangqi describing gauges. Next slide, please. Again, I'm not sure what he means by stopping only when both curvature gauges match. However, next slide, please. I am certain as to what the author means by 半径尺, which I've translated as a ruler that has the radius marked out, or 曲倍尺, which I have translated as curvature gauge. He means something like the things I saw in the Palazzo Poggi that Campani used to make his own lenses in the middle of the 17th century. The tools on the top are what Xu Guangqi would have called Campani's 曲倍尺, used to gauge curvature, and on the bottom are his 半径尺, pieces of metal that mark the radius length. Xu Guangqi must have learned some of this from a Jesuit, or more than one, with practical lens-making expertise. Next slide, please. One obvious vector for this kind of knowledge would have been Giovanni Paolo Lembo, a Jesuit maker of telescopes, who was known to have taught lens grinding at the Collegio de Santo Antoine in Lisboa, the last stop for many missionaries before traveling to Asia. Next slide, please. Notes taken by a student in his class reveal practical instruction. A graduate of this kind of teaching might easily have had the knowledge that translated into Xu Guangqi's remarks. But a student of Lembo would not have been able to collaborate just with Xu Guangqi. Whether those are words, the technical words that I just explained, were invented by Xu Guangqi or not, they are certainly words that emerged out of conversation with local craftsmen. In other places too, the text implicates not just the work of craftsmen, but their persons. Next slide, please. Note that a grinder must be sent out, not just that the grinding sand must be acquired. Use the finest polishing sand, which is sold at the jewelry establishments in Suzhou. Nor is it that the polishing sand itself can only be acquired by a grinder. I imagine that this store could only have been known to Xu Guangqi, who never lived in Suzhou, after a craftsman told him about it. So in other words, this text might have been written by one ruling class Chinese man, but it must have been the product of many conversations involving a range of interlocutors. It's easy to imagine this as the unusual case in 17th century China in which an official and an educated man played a relatively marginal role. A student of Lembo's working with the palace and hence the world's most skilled jade craftsman might well have made relatively short work of making a Galilean telescope. But the text emerges out of at least a tripod of contexts. The unnamed Jesuit or multiple Jesuits who had studied with Lembo, palace-affiliated craftsmen who were expert at shaping jade into whatever shape they wanted, and the classically educated Xu Guangqi himself, all of them brought together to complete a complicated and perhaps impossible commission from the Chongzhen Emperor. So the Kaichen Jiyao were not regarded as part of Xu Guangqi's official writings, and according to Gongyian's research, it only survived through a series of unlikely events. Gongyian posits that the text was never edited, never mind published. It was held in the collection of Xu Guangqi's descendant, Xu Chaojun, and these notes were recopied in 1857 by a well-known bibliophile, Han Yingbi. Han Yingbing says, and this is in a little postscript in the manuscript, there are words and phrases that are in error and can't be parsed. It can't be published. I would argue that Han Yingbing simply didn't know what he was reading at all. But at any rate, I'm virtually certain that these notes stayed more or less private, unread by anyone who might use them. My best guess is that any work on telescopes in the palace workshops went on hiatus during the fall of the dynasty in 1644. And after the fall of the dynasty, the craftsmen who had learned from Lembo's students never used their skills again. Xu Guangqi's notes seem not to have been read by anyone for more than a century. And it is striking to me that in these almost 400-year-old notes, we're actually finally in a position to understand them. They record the interactions of a group of people, stone grinders who are jewelry makers, at least one Jesuit, probably more, an official, who brought together disparate skills and knowledge, who came together having grown up learning different things in different languages. And it happens that I have brought together another group of people almost 400 years later, with other specialty knowledges to mirror those. Practical knowledge of lens grinding, Sandy, comprehensive knowledge of early telescopes, Marv, knowledge of early modern European lens making, Giorgio. If all texts are messages in bottles flung into the ocean of the future, it feels miraculous that sometimes a group of moderns can sometimes come together and make a landing place for them. Thank you. I think the next person to go should be Marv.
All right, thank you, Tina, for that tour and gracious introduction. My presentation has two components, really. One is strategies for making the lenses, and then the second part is on placing the lenses in the appropriate place. We'll see how far we can get through that in the presentation part, and then also in the Q&A element. So if we can have the second slide, please. All right, thank you. So lenses come in two varieties, really. In the first, on the left side, the function is to gather light and condense it or converge it, and that's called a positive lens because the focal point is on the right side, on the downstream side, if you will. On the other lens, on the right side, the second function of a lens is to diverge light, and it's a negative lens because the focus is on the upstream side. All right, so converging or diverging. And the distance from the lens to that focal point is the crucial detail that we're going to take a look at. So on the next slide, we have a variety of ways in which we can combine positive and negative lenses, but we don't have to worry too much about that here, other than to say that it is possible to combine these in some way. All right, next slide. So magnifiers of some sort have been known since antiquity, and especially in the centuries before the development of spectacles, we have these rock crystals that can be made out of either quartz or beryllium. And then if we click one more, there's an etymological little distinction here, which is, if we can just click that, Scott, that beryllium has lent itself to the Dutch and German word for spectacles, brill. And that's not a coincidence because those early spectacles could either be made out of rock crystal, beryllium, brill, or glass. And it's not always clear which is being used. And this would be a great topic for further research for anyone out there who's interested in this. All right, next, please. So in that next slide, we see that distance from the lens to the focal point plays a crucial role in distinguishing between a magnifier and a spectacle. If we can go to the next slide. This requires us to take a little detour into human vision. So normal vision, visually acute vision, the light coming in from the left side passes through the cornea and the lens and comes to a focus on the back of the eyeball, the retina. Next, please. For those of us who've reached the age of 30 and beyond, we have a little challenge there because the lens and cornea don't quite focus correctly. They're not quite as pliable as they used to be in our youth. And so the focal point happens behind the retina. This can also be if the eyeball is too short. And then finally, a second problem is that the focal point can be, if we can flip the next one, please. The focal point can happen before the retina. Now, why is this of significance? Well, in the next animation, we can see that if we put, the next one, please. Thank you. If we put a converging lens just in front of the eyeball, we can see that it just nudges that focal point to be not behind the retina, but on the retina. And if we show the next concave lens, the diverging lens, if that focal point in the retina is just before the retina, that diverging lens can move it back a little bit beyond. Now, this is just a very, very slight adjustment that we need, all right? Not a huge one. So if we go to the next slide, we have what looks to be a magnifier, at least what we would think of as a magnifier, but notice that this optical device is not on the book itself, but is in front of the eye. It is a vision correction. It is not a magnifier placed next to the object. And if we go to the next slide, we can see another very early illustration, the earliest known illustration of a pair of spectacles found in a scriptorium in Treviso, just north of Venice. And you can get the scale of what these illustrations are like. So now if we go to the next slide, we can see, again, there's two animations here, just a quick double click there, please. We can see that those lenses just make a slight variation as opposed to a magnifier, which has a short focal length and a great variation in the concentration of light. All right, next slide, please. So in the process of grinding, we actually remove a fair amount of glass from the surface so that the shape actually changes. And then in the second and third and subsequent grindings, less and less material gets removed from the glass until in the very final stage, the polishing removes the very small bumps and valleys and smooths them all out. But the grinding stage changes the shape. All right, next slide, please. So there are a couple of variations on how you can actually grind and polish. You can either have the tool, the grinding tool, rotate and the glass be stationary, or you can have the tool be stationary and move the glass. Next slide, please. So the glass would be placed on a little pistol like this and attached to it. And the grinding tool will remove enough glass to change the shape of it. Next slide, please. So the gentle curvature of a spectacle lens is in fact exactly the same curvature as the lens for a telescope objective. It's not that short focal length of a magnifier, but the longer one. For those of you who have eyeglasses and you might have a strength of the glass of 2 diopters, say, that's 100 centimeters divided by 2, or 50 centimeters. That's the focal length of your spectacles, which is exactly the kind of thing you want for a telescope objective. But here's the catch. When you have spectacles, you only have the very central part of the spectacle actually impacting the image that forms on the retina, roughly the same size as your pupil. For a telescope objective, the entire lens produces the image or impacts the image. So any defect that's in the spectacle lens, well, it doesn't have quite the impact that a telescope lens would have. So if you have a small range in your spectacle lens that is of a consistent curvature, you get a good image. But you need that same curvature to be consistent over the entire lens if you want a telescope objective. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Suppose we take a pair of spectacles. This one is from about somewhere in the 15th century. And next, please. We use them to create a telescope. You'll see that it's kind of fuzzy. It's kind of unsharp. It's blurry. But there's a trick to this. And on the next animation, please. What we do is we can test this with a test developed in the 20th century by putting a grid of wires in front of the lens and seeing what that grid of wires looks like. Now, if that lens had a very nice spherical shape, those lines would be straight. And as you can see, those lines here are not very straight at all, resulting in a blurry image. But if we go to the next illustration, please. If in fact we just use the central portion of these lenses and block off the exterior parts, we actually can produce a telescope that enlarges well and enlarges sharply. So next animation. That is to say, if we put a donut or diaphragm over the front of the lens, and we can do that on the right one too, Now we have a telescope. And if we have the last one on this slide, we look at the very oldest telescope that's securely dated, we see that that in fact is the strategy. All right, so what's the takeaway from all this? Spectacles appear around 1290s, and within 20 years, they're readily available. In fact, the price of spectacles in 1316 is about 1 day's wage for a common laborer. And if we think of New York State, at least, where the minimum wage is 15 bucks an hour times 820 bucks, that's actually about the price of a pair of glasses, a simple pair of glasses. In fact, for 700 years, the price of glasses has remained roughly the same. So what this means is that you actually have widespread availability of spectacles at a price that's accessible to more people than you might have thought. In fact, we know that thousands of them were made in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. There's a record, in fact, in 1540 of 24,000 spectacles that were shipped from Venice to Constantinople. So these are commonly available devices, but not suitable for telescopes because they couldn't be shaped in a way that makes a telescope possible. So I will do 1 or 2 more slides here, and then we'll get back to telescopes in the Q&A. So if we go to the next slide, please. That's the oldest securely dated telescope in the world. You can see at the left side there how much of the lens is actually blocked. In Tina's text, there is an allusion to that. There's also an allusion to the tubes. And in this case, the tube is made out of cardboard. It's made out of paper. And one of the reasons is that, as you can see here, it's very hard to hold this up for any length of time. And the earliest tubes made out of metal would have been way too heavy to hold for a long period of time. It also consists of multiple tubes that can be drawn in and out. And the last slide we'll take a look at. Next click, please. And the next. And finally, the next. We see that for this, excuse me, for this telescope, the stopping down of that lens matches the stopping down of spectacles made before that time. So we know this is the strategy for making a spectacle into a telescope. And that's all we'll say about the glass, the lenses of telescopes, other than to say these lenses could be made out of either glass or rock crystal, just as the early spectacles could be made out of beryllium, or glass. It's not always clear what material is being used for the lenses of these early telescopes. All right, we'll come back to some of these things in the Q&A. Thank you.
Maybe we'll move now to Giorgio.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, so if you can, okay, I go on. So I will go back to Galileo and his telescope, because we know that Galileo was not the inventor of the telescope, but he was just the one that improved the device. And he learned about the invention of the telescope that was made in the Netherlands by a spectral maker. He knew about that from one of his friend's correspondence, and he immediately started in 1609 to improve the instruments, just by using, at the beginning, spectacle lenses. As Marvin Bolt told us, they were of 2 types, concave or convex, and Galileo discovered by himself, by just reusing using the lenses, that the combination of a convex lens as an objective, a very feeble, not very powerful convex lens as an objective, and a concave lens as an ocular, he discovered that it was possible to magnify object. But if you made very feeble objective lenses, very feeble convex lenses, and very strong concave lens, you can improve the magnification. So in a matter of a few months, Galileo passed from a magnification of about 3 times to a magnification of about 10 times by August 1609, and then to a magnification about 12 times and 20 times by the end of the year of 1609. And at the beginning of 1610, he had perhaps a magnification of 30 times. That was the maximum of his device. About the making of the lenses, we know very few things about Galileo activity, because he maintained a secret, because he had the possibility to discover very important things in the sky. So he wanted to have maintain the secret of how he discovered them. But he had a few clues in Galileo's correspondence, for instance. And one of the most important and intriguing is a note that Galileo jotted down on a letter that he received, a list of things to look for in a travel to Venice. Galileo was living in Padua, that is about a few kilometers from Venice. And so in one of his next trip to Venice, he wanted to look for a few things. They include things for his family and things for the pantry and other not important things. But at one point, we start to see interesting things. As for instance, the first thing is 2 artillery bolts, an organ pipe made of tin, and then different type of glasses, German ground glasses, rock crystal, and pieces of mirror. That are the material for, as we heard from Marvin Bolt, for making the lenses. And then other materials, for instance, as Tripoli, that was a powder for grinding the glass, and other tools for grinding, colophony for attaching the glass to some tool, felt, parchment, and so other things like that. This is just something that immediately recalls what we saw in Tina's text, the Chinese text of about 1630. And this list, why Galileo comes in 1609, so there are 20-year difference, but we already see the grinding materials and they're looking for good glass or rock crystal, because that was the important part of making a telescope, the quality of the glass. And we know from Galileo's correspondence of those years that he was going around to look for good transparent glass. That was the basic material for the lenses, but he was also corresponding with some people that was able to furnish pieces of glass. But looking at the correspondence, we have to be very careful, because the Italian term vetro at the beginning of the 17th century could mean several things: the rough materials, the glass itself, or panes of glass, or the lenses themselves. So we don't know exactly if Galileo was looking for already made lenses or he was trying to make his own lenses. There is a good indication that he was trying to do that, also by other letters. And we know almost nothing about his tools, but for a claim that was perhaps an excuse for not coming immediately from Padua to Florence when he was called by the Grand Duke of Tuscany in a service, because Galileo just says that he cannot come immediately to Florence because he had to remove tools from his workshop, and some of those tools were attached to the walls of his workshop. So perhaps an excuse, but we don't know what tools are exactly. About the connection with the manuscript, I see several connections because the manuscript that Tina showed us immediately as looking for transparent glass, then the structure of a convex and convex lens. That means that the Jesuit in China was trying to make a Galilean telescope, and then the tools for the molds for grinding the glass and making good lenses. But there are also strange indication about the thickness of the glass, because in some points the Jesuit says that you can use glass for making the biconvex lens for the objective, because the glass is too thin. And that is strange, because it means that the maker was just looking for pieces of flat glass already prepared by other people. There is, as in Galileo shopping list, there is the looking for workshop that were able to furnish grinding power of different thickness, and we see all this also in the shopping list by Galileo, but also in the manuscript by the Jesuits, the Chinese Jesuit. So, and we have something about the machines, the lathe for having rotating tools and so on. So there is some connection, but we don't know exactly what is that Galileo was doing, because in Italy we have the first book on telescope making only in 1618. So about 10 years after the invention of the telescope, and about 8 years after Galileo made his best telescope. So I don't know how much confusing I was for everyone. And I pass the word back to Tina Lu.
Okay, and I'm going to turn it to Sandy.
Sandy, sorry.
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandy Chang. I apologize for the noise in the background because I'm actually in the airport ready to go on to another flight very soon. So I'm going to offer a little bit of a modern perspective. I made 2 6-inch telescope mirrors, one with my daughters, and I want to share with you some of the grinding technologies that went into the making of these 2 telescope mirrors, and how amazingly unchanged this technology was from the time that Tina has described with her manuscript, and Marvin and Giorgio has described with their lens making technologies. Next slide. Okay, so to grind a 6-inch mirror, what you need are a blank, which is the actual glass disc that will become a telescope mirror, and the tool. So you heard that Tina's manuscript uses bronze tools. We use a ceramic tool. I made one out of tiles from, actually they're just bathroom tiles, the hexagonal bathroom tiles, glued on top of a plaster of Paris disc. And that's used to polish the glass blank. So the glass blank is polished through a series of grits, silicon carbides of different sizes, starting from 60 grits. So the grit number is the number of particles per inch. So obviously the smaller the number, the finer the grit. So we start with 60 and then went all the way up to 1000 with fine polishing. And this is done in a way that's exactly unchanged for 500 years. Do it on top of a, basically a stand, rotate the mirrors on the bottom, the tools on top. We put grit in the between them with some water, and you polish in this stroke called the normal stroke. Next slide. And that's what mirror making is at least amateur telescope mirror making is, you can see that I'm putting grit on my mirror blank on the bottom, squirt water on top of the tool, and make this stroke called the normal stroke, which is 1/3 center over center. And then you walk around this barrel. You can see that I'm doing this with my daughter on the image on the right. So we walk, every time we do 4 or 5 strokes, we rotate the mirror in a random fashion. We walk around in the opposite direction and keep on doing this. And I think one of the things that Tina was mentioning was actually these gauges. The gauges that we use actually measures the depth that we actually generate as we grind. And the depth is directly proportional to the radius of curvature of the mirror. So to get the right focal length, you have to have the right depth. And that's something that you have to control very carefully from the early stages of the grinding process. And once the depth is achieved, then fine grinding doesn't take away too much surface of the mirror. So you can see that rough grinding is using silicon carbide from 80, 60 to 80 to 120, 220, 320 grit. And then fine grinding is anything up to 1,000 grit, which is about 5 microns. Next slide, please. Okay, so after you fine grind, what you have to do now is polish. Polishing uses a compound called pitch. Pitch is this weird black tree resin-like gooey thing, but it has an amazing property in that it actually combined with very fine polishing compound called rouge. It actually allows the rouge to only stick up a little bit above the surface of the pitch, and it makes extremely close contact with the mirror surface. So the polishing stroke allows extremely fine control of the surface. And in a few hours, you can actually get a very nice surface that you could actually call a finished product. So what we do with mirror making is we achieve a spherical surface first using this polishing and figuring technique. Using a stroke called the W stroke, we can actually convert the spherical surface into a parabola. So the mirror that I made in the beginning is a 6-inch f5, focal ratio of 5. So with that short focal ratio, you have to have a parabola. A spherical surface will cause what's called spherical aberration, which is obviously not desirable. That's exactly what happened to the Hubble Space Telescope. It actually has spherical aberration. The mirror was polished, very high accuracy, but to a wrong figure. So in this case, I polished it to a parabola. It took several hours. You can see that making the pitch is actually a really hard thing. That's the hardest part of mirror making, is actually making a correct pitch lap, but the actual polishing doesn't take very much time at all. Next slide. So how do you know you're done? So in modern mirror making, you always have to test your mirror against a setup. So Marvin showed you this Ronchi testing, which uses a wire. That's a very good way to test, but the way we do it now with even higher accuracy is to use what's called an autocollimation test. In this test, we're actually comparing the surface of the mirror that I'm generating with a known flat of a good optical figure. So we're comparing my mirror that's being made with a known surface of known quantity. So what we're looking at, same thing with our Ronchi test that Marvin showed, is straight lines. So you can see that as you polish, your mirror is going to have curved lines because you haven't got to the right surface. But as you do more and more finer polishing, you hit that straight line and then you stop. So the bottom figure, you can see that in my mirror, you can see these very nice straight lines. And that I know I have a very nice 6-inch f5 parabola for my first telescope, which is shown in the upper right. And the second telescope, which I made with my 2 daughters, we made a telescope with a longer focal length, 6-inch f9, and both mirrors actually won their year's optical competition at this national telescope makers conference called Stellafate. This is the end of my presentation, so I'll give it back to Tina.
So, I mean, I thought that we would now just have a discussion and field any questions. This just makes me feel like I need to actually sit Sandy down over lunch, since we live in the same town and work for the same university, and actually get his precise language about the how you measure curvature and what my manuscript was actually doing. But we're here to answer any questions and also to like engage in a conversation. Does anybody have any questions? I'm looking at the chat right now. Oh, should I look at the Q&A? No, there are no open questions. Does anybody have any questions? So I'd actually like to know, so you, Sandy, are using glass against glass, which is basically, is that correct?
It's really ceramic against glass. You could do glass against glass, but I use bathroom tiles and with channels in it, because that's a much faster way to grind. The channels allow distribution of the grit that gets ground down. It flows off through the channels. So you can have much better contact between the undamaged grit with the glass. So I think that's why your optician that you're talking about uses a very solid metal or bronze to do it. So they probably could achieve a rough grinding surface much faster than using glass on glass.
Okay, I mean, I think that glass is a very precious substance for them because all of their glass is imported from Europe. And so, they're probably actually repurposing some other glass to make telescopes.
Right, I use good old Corning Pyrex glass.
Okay, the early 17th century Jesuits did not have Corning Pyrex.
Right.
They would have loved it. There are all sorts of records of people being absolutely overwhelmed by seeing glass prisms from Europe. So, Corning Pyrex would have hey, you can even microwave it. They would have been so overjoyed. So you, one of the things that the text mentions, that passage about what happens when the shape is wrong and it has a bulge. Can I actually have my slides by any chance?
Give me 1 second, and yes, you can.
Okay, I would love your take on what is going on there and what is meant by that.
Yeah, Tina, I found that fascinating because one of the things that we have to worry about in mirror making is also this bulge in the center. So the center down is called turn down edge in optical parlance. And that's a big boo-boo in making a mirror because the outer edge of the mirror is in a wrong figure and you don't want that. So I'm wondering whether the person is actually talking about a turn down edge for your lenses in that description of the kettle-shaped figure.
So we're gonna get, okay, here we go.
Was there a specific slide, Tina?
Yeah, keep going until the slide with it's all words, but it's the least words. Stop. The previous one, please. There. There.
My
Stop.
apologies.
Got any ideas what that means?
Yeah, I think the person is trying to correct a wrong figure using a tool that he's shaping into some kind of a weird shape to try to correct some localized figure deformity. That's the most I could get out of it.
Okay. And what about, and we're delighted to have people ask questions. So I'm just surveying to see whether there are any questions here. What about I don't have the complete text in slides here, but Sandy has read the slides, and what you don't know is that Sandy is not only a medical school professor, amateur lens grinder, but he's actually been checking my classical Chinese translation as well.
I'm not checking. I'm just looking at it. Your translations are spot
on. So what about the fact that in the grinding, he keeps saying you stop when the grinding water comes out and it's just water.
Right. I think that's just the slurry. So the water that when we grind a mirror or a lens, the composition of the water changes. As in the beginning, you still have a lot of grit that's on ground with broken glass. So the water is going to come out very sort of full of sandy-like material. As you grind and the mirror becomes smoother and smoother, the composition of the water becomes less and less gritty, becomes more and more liquidy. So I think that's what he's just saying, that the next stage of the grinding process is achieved, that he has to use a finer grit. You have to change your grit.
Okay. Martha Custer wants to know why it was important to predict a solar eclipse. So Martha, the reason is because since probably around, even our very earliest Chinese sources that date from about 2,500 years ago, a little earlier than that, eclipses, one of the functions of the state was to keep track of the heavens. And eclipses had, often people felt like they would predict something about like the state of the government. And so we actually, like, the first known record of the Andromeda Crab Nebula is from pre-modern Chinese materials. And there's actually great documents people are using now to go through these texts and to see what was going on in the heavens. But unfortunately, by the 17th century, these calculations that had been done earlier had gotten a little wonky. And that like calendrical calculations need to be retabulated ever so often, especially in pre-modern times. And so the fact that the government missed a solar eclipse was actually a huge, huge scandal. In fact, that particular government fell 34 years later. So maybe there was like, they were onto something, but then they actually did set up a kind of competition. And it's actually, I think, fascinating to many people and very little known that one of the teams were Uyghurs using essentially algebra from the Arabic world. So that is why. And of course, this was a great moment for the Jesuits, who had just arrived in China, like about 20, 30 years before then, to showcase the fact that they had something to offer. Is that somebody speaking? Is somebody asking a question? Are there any other questions? Does Giorgio or Marvin have anything to say at this point?
So I have a question. I have a question for Sandy, because a few years ago, I remember in a symposium, the Scientific Instrument Commission, that Jim Bennett, at the time was director of the Oxford Museum of History of Science, spoke about William Herschel and his techniques in making mirrors, and they have a complete series of particular strokes for making the mirror, for grinding the mirrors. Sandy, did you have aware of that?
Yes. So William Herschel is a hero of mine because he made metal mirrors. He didn't have glass. Glass, again, was expensive in the 1700s. So he made specular mirrors. Also, he didn't have a way to illuminize glass like we do now. So he had to have developed a series of very intricate strokes because he had to deal with metal, specular metal. We don't have such challenges when we come to glass because our figures are easier to control. So I told you about the normal stroke that we do 1/3 over 1/3 polishing. And then we use a W stroke to make a wide parabola. But sometimes if you get a hill in the middle of the mirror, you have to make smaller W strokes, or you have to use what's called quarto strokes to just polish the edge of the mirror. So there are definitely like 4 or 5 different strokes that you have to master in order to tame the figure of your mirror, which is not easy. And again, it's all done in the figuring process where you do with the pitch lab and multiple testings going up to the double autopass autocollimator, looking at the figure, figuring out what the error is, taking it off and doing it again. So it's a lot of just trial by error. And I'm just amazed that the early lens makers can achieve that kind of perfection that Marvin was showing. Those Ronchi lines were totally straight. It was incredible. those are the figures that we will be happy with today. With our modern technology, then the ancient lens makers were doing that, 500 years ago without any real tools to test. I'm just amazed by their abilities. It's really, truly remarkable.
Thank you.
Marvin, do you have anything to say?
I actually want to show illustrations or photos of a couple of the oldest surviving Chinese telescopes and a couple of observations about that. So could we go to slide 37 in my PowerPoint, please? And while that's coming up, I'll notice in Western traditions, you can have these tubes made of cardboard, wood, metal, gold, silver, even ivory. It indicates a distinction, a division of labor between the glass-making folks and the other kinds of decorative arts that were necessary for putting lenses in the right places, not only for optical reasons, but for aesthetic reasons. Don't know if that's possible to get up that set of slides or not. Oh, great, thank you. So yeah, there's an ivory one. Next slide would be a gold one that is incredibly heavy, solid gold. And then another one, the next one is silver. We'll go to the next slide. Something that has not come up yet, but has been mentioned only in 2 publications that I can find, that when Galileo is actually messing around with a glass composition and complaining that glass gets recycled and therefore it's bad, this is also the time that Antonio Neri is writing The Art of Glassmaking. And Galileo has access to this book, but that connection has not been explored. All right, next slide, which is where I wanted to go. There's a lovely book that's hard to find on the scientific and technical instruments that are in the Palace Museum, the Forbidden City in Beijing. And so the next slide, please. On the right side there, you have probably the 2 earliest telescopes that survived that were made in China. It says it's made out of wood with some lacquer. I've had the chance to look at one of these, but I had about 4 minutes to look at it. I was not allowed to take any photos, and most crucially, I wasn't allowed to take it apart, which is how I really need to look at these to study them. But these are the oldest known ones, and the aesthetic is very interesting. On it, there's a crescent moon with a star shining through the moon, which tells you that the person decorating it isn't really informed about astronomy. And I find that to be really, really interesting. The next slide, please. Here we have on the bottom a telescope that sort of looks European, but is apparently made in the Ching workshop, which has all sorts of interesting things to, it brings up a whole lot of issues that are interesting and merit more discussion. But the one I really want to look at is the top one. So telescopes have to place the lenses at very, very specific locations. And these tubes, when you pull them out, have a little mark on them that tells you how far to pull them apart. That one on the top is traditionally thought of as Japanese. And what's distinct about it is that the tubes aren't cylindrical, but they're conical. That is to say, when they're compacted, the tubes roll and rattle around, but when they're pulled apart, they get tight. It's the only style, or it's the only example of that style. If the label on this is correct, that it's actually made in China, this would be a very, very interesting thing to find out. What it illustrates is that we really have a wide range of expertise that's needed to examine these objects, not just the glass, but the decorative arts aspect, and that there are technology transfers and aesthetic techniques that transfer that really make these topics incredibly interesting and interdisciplinary.
So that first telescope that you showed is labeled early Qing, but there is no way that's a 1650s telescope. That's clearly part of this first push to make telescopes, probably in the 1620s, early 1630s. And it very well is connected to the text that I have been sharing. That seems to me part of that same generation, where there is one record, and I didn't share it in the interest of brevity, of it's clear that they simply had lenses that they had that they brought over from Europe, and they put them into a tube. So, you know, they were talking about making the tube, but not really making the lenses. And then they moved on to trying to make lenses. And it's not actually clear whether they succeeded at any point.
No, that's right. I think that it's a very early one, and we have to get to Beijing. And
I know.
Take me with you, please.
Yeah,
Marvin, I have a question for you. How did they collimate the lenses in an ivory tube telescope?
I wish I knew the answer to that. The ivory telescope that I showed was probably made in Germany, and may have even been made in a royal workshop by royalty, because that was, in fact, a skill that was taught to keep nobility grounded, if you will. So it dates from probably 1650 to 1670, but basic techniques for how you would align these lenses, there is no description anywhere that I've seen about how to do that. And it's really extraordinary that they were able to do that. That brings up one other topic, and I know we're running out of time. The very first telescope demonstrated in 1608 called for the production of another one that was binocular, because, I mean, let's face it, we have two eyes, we want to see through both of them, and a telescope with only one eye, one optical system, that seemed unthinkable. And apparently Lippershey produced one, but making binoculars is incredibly difficult. There are half a dozen examples that are known from the 17th century, and then it's virtually unknown until the end of the 19th century because it's so difficult. So my answer to that is, how did they do it? Trial and error and luck.
You're still doing it that way.
Well, that's actually the amazing thing, that the kind of, you know, we know Galileo tested hundreds of lenses to find the ones that worked, and that actually now, you know, Sandy, you were describing even, you know, the way that you find out whether the lens curvature is right is you test it. So
take it out and test it again.
Yeah, I find that really fascinating as well.
It's very tedious. We take it out. Sometimes if you don't have the testing equipment, you could use a star to do it. I actually put the mirror back into a telescope, aim it at a star, and look at the star pattern under very high magnification. I could figure out what's wrong with the mirror. Then we pull it out and grind it some, polish it some more. So
that's what Galileo did.
Exactly. We still doing exactly the same thing. Testing equipment just make that you know, not unnecessary. But if you don't have the testing equipment, you still got to do it the old-fashioned.
So we have one more question. I'm trying to find it. Could whoever asked the question just type it in? Because I wonder whether we are actually.
Yeah, someone commented about the lens. That's one thing I didn't say is making a mirror is much easier because I only have to make one optical surface. Making a lens, you have to make at least two for the simple lenses. That the telescope that Marvin and Tina, you were showing. But for modern lenses, I have telescopes made out of 3 lenses. That's 6 surfaces you have to polish. Those are the apochromats, and those are the pinnacle of optical telescope making. And that is something that's way beyond the skills of a mere amateur. I mean, I cannot make it's hard. They tell people that if you want to make a lens, a refractor, a lens telescope, go make 2 mirrors first, because the skills you learn from making mirrors will translate very well into making a lens. So I could probably go and make my own first simple lens, but not an apochromat.
So there is a note in Galileo's shopping list that he was looking for pieces of mirror. So if you look for mirrors, you have part of the problem solvers in polishing the lens, because one face of the mirror is already grinded and plain. So you only need to grind the second surface to make it convex or concave. So that is a way to simplify the problem.
That's right.
And that's mentioned in Tina's text as well. You only want to do one side, probably for that reason. I'll make one last, well, sort of last comment. The spectacles that are in service around the time of the appearance of the telescope, so around 1600, they didn't have to be good, and there wasn't incentive to make them better because your brain can sort of accommodate for imperfections in spectacles. But after the telescope comes, you need better grinding and polishing techniques to have better surfaces. And so the telescope's actually a motivation to improve spectacles as well. And that's, I think, reflected a little bit in that text as well.
Cool.
Okay.
Awesome.
I think, I want to thank you all. This, I learned so much, and I'm going to be following up with each of you. So expect a new barrage of emails. And for the audience, let's all give a kind of virtual round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us today. That was wonderful. So much fun.
And like, we are going to have lunch very soon, Sandy. And Marv,
absolutely.
Giorgio, I'm going to like try to, pin you down for some Zooms soon. Thank you so much. And have a great afternoon. Sandy, have a safe trip.
Thank you. Bye, Tina.
Bye.
Bye, Marvin.
Thank you.
Bye, Giorgio.